year by year. It takes a few minutes, but it would be very much appreciated. There was a late addition to the program in Lanyard, so the Sakai Institutional Interest Group, which I mentioned in my opening remarks, is at 9:45 in Alto. If you have an interest in working with other institutions to shape the future of Sakai, you should be there. I mentioned also in opening on Monday the importance of analytics to the future of our software, particularly to the future of Sakai, the open academic environment, and student success plan. Judging by the that importance is widely recognized. And our developing relationship with SOLA, the Society of Learning Analytics Research, is an important element in informing the future of our software. Very, very direct relevance. So our speaker this morning at Keynote, George Siemens, will be known to you for his formative work on connectivist MOOCs. He's currently Executive Director of the Learning Innovation and Network Knowledge Research Lab at the University of Texas at Arlington, and was one of the founders of SOLA. So without further ado, please welcome George Siemens.
Thank you, and particularly thank you to the Apereo Foundation for the opportunity to address the group today. I'm unfortunately one of those keynote speakers that I completely disliked when I first started in the speaking and conference circuit, which is the person that shows up last minute and leaves shortly after the keynote. So I apologize in advance for that. I had an engagement that I had committed to earlier before this opportunity came up. So in theory, I may well be a jerk, but it's for different reasons than the fact that I showed up late and leave early today. One of the things that I think is quite relevant and increasingly critical in the educational space is for educators and designers of softwares and even learning systems to start to become more aware of what role data plays as a key economic and even power value point in that relationship. And so I'm going to be addressing a series of about 5 topics reasonably quickly. I'd like to leave about 15 minutes or so for questions, so I'll try and move through these at a reasonable pace. But I want to start by giving you a little bit of a background on what's happening very broadly educationally and why analytics starts to become important there. Then I'm going to turn into the token identification of what are learning analytics, what kinds of things might educators be able to do with learning analytics, as well as the kind of software that's required in order to make that happen. And then I'm going to turn to talk about creativity and the importance of us identifying and advancing new ideas and new ways of thinking in the learning process and the way that that bumps up against the technologies that we often use. A related concept to creativity is that of sense-making, namely the processes that we use to make sense of the world around us and how that is reflected ultimately in the need for the final point being open learning analytics. So that's the agenda. Background. One of the things that's quite fascinating educationally is there's been a narrative change in the last, certainly decade, but it's been going on longer than that, is what is the role of education in society? And there's a growing number of reports being produced by foundations, government agencies, consulting agencies that are trying to equate, and to a fair degree accurately, the importance of education as preparation for employment. Now, personally, I adhere to the view that the value of an education is so that one can be privately happy and publicly useful. And so as a result, an education should be about more than just simply developing the skills for employment. But for most of us and for most of our students, that is a central aspect of why they're going to university. So we can't ignore that. And one of the fascinating aspects of the labor market is in the last century, we've seen almost a complete reversal in terms of the percentage of the economy that is involved in what's called routine or manual labor versus those that are involved in the creative or knowledge type work. About 120 years ago, 80 to 90% of the market was around routine labor, and today depending on the regions of the world that you're looking at, the growing percentage of that work is being done in knowledge segments, and I'll address that a little bit in the next slide. So knowledge work is growing in prominence, and a lot of the routine work that we've done in the past is being automated. In the US alone, production jobs now sit at around 15% of the overall economy, which is, as I mentioned, almost an exact reversal from where things were about a century ago. In developing regions of the world, even in those areas, the transition to a knowledge-oriented or a learning-heavy economy is also becoming more and more pronounced. Corresponding with the labor market transitions, there's also a growing range of needs that individual learners have. The student profiles that we have today are very different from what we had even 15 years ago in terms of who's entering the university system, what kinds of degrees are they taking, and what's the profile of that student. In the US, for example, now less than 50% of students are traditional full-time students. The sequential, I graduated from high school, made it to university. I was 18, 17 years old when I started, graduating when I'm 22, 23, or somewhere in that cycle. According to OECD, the emerging student profile now favors, in some cases very heavily, 70 to 80% in some fields, but favors women. As a percentage overall, developing and developed regions of the world, the percentage of students that are entering higher education is increasing. So when you have about 15% of your population, or even 20% of your population entering higher education, you have a different need of student support structures than you do if you have up to 60% of the student population entering higher education. You have 15 to 20% even at that level. These are typically your brightest, most engaged, most focused students. But as you hear more of a narrative in society, everybody's got to get a degree, you've got to go to university. Suddenly you have individuals who don't enjoy the traditional academic model and experience. They're entering universities, and that's why what we often call administrator bloat is a dramatic increase in support services in higher education to help bring those emerging percentages of students entering higher education towards successful completion. Another aspect is the increased age of entrance. In some regions now, students who are coming back after they've been in the labor market for a while, either to reskill or develop or get a new degree, or even just they've entered the labor force for a while, the routine labor that existed is now not available anymore, and they return to the university sector in order to reskill or upgrade. And so the age of students entering universities is increasing, or higher education broadly is increasing. And of course, a few other factors, there's growing internationalization as university systems around the world are facing budget cuts and so on. They follow the trends where money is, and internationalization is a strategy that's quite prominent, at least in the US, as the number one recipient of international students, but certainly Australia, UK, Canada, those are increasingly becoming big strategy areas. So we end up then very broadly, by way of a background, is we have a complexification of the education system. The role that universities used to play in society in the past is becoming more broad, and far more so in certain sectors and certain areas. It could be argued, and I would, that Detroit, for example, may well have had a different economic outcome if it had a large private university in that particular city or that particular region. Mainly because the degree completion and the attainment rates of the region were in the low single digits, which means you have limited ability to recombine skills and drive new startups. But nonetheless, as we're looking at this, learning is complexifying, it's ongoing, the narrative of what university is for is broadening, and the idea of a university generally is changing as well, as more universities are offering startups and incubators and corporate learning partnerships, and the list goes on. So going forward, contrary to the narrative that you've probably heard of the university is dying, I'll make a statement that in the next decade, globally, we're going to see a net expansion in the number of university systems around the world. We're not going to see this catastrophic drop in we'll only have 10 universities by 2050, or we're going to have half universities in the US close down in the next 5 to 10 years. There may be some regions where there'll be some shifting overall, but given the change of what we see with the student profile, the change economically for the type of learning that we need, the next decade will produce a net increase in universities globally. So that's my background or lens. I want to turn now and talk a little bit about learning analytics. Learning analytics is a concept that it sounds like, and I was able to catch a little bit of the discussion on Twitter and some of the bits and pieces of what was being talked about. So it certainly seems that this audience is well acquainted with the general idea of learning analytics. And essentially, whether you look at it from an academic or research perspective, it's really about the ability for educators to escalate the rate at which we do research on some of the more pressing problems in education. It's the ability to use the data that students generate through the learning experience in order to improve the quality of learning and the quality of teaching. So put another way, there's a related term that you've probably heard about called academic analytics. And academic analytics are essentially business intelligence applied to the operation of the university. That means the focus might be on resource allocation, it might be on energy saving, and a range of other factors. That's not what I'm looking at when I talk about learning analytics. So for me, learning analytics needs to involve, first and foremost, the learner, the institution, or some combination of institutions, and an educator at some level. Not exclusively, you can certainly do self-regulated learning, but by and large, the emphasis is on that triad of institution, educator, and learner, with learner being prominent. And so some of the techniques that we use in the learning analytics process, so this is based on first some work that I did with Ryan Baker, who's the president of the International Educational Data Mining Society, as well as a report that was done by Bree Biankowski from SRI on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education. So essentially, when we engage in learning analytics activity, we're doing a range of about 6 specific things, or much of the work that we do fits into these areas. One could be about modeling, whether we're modeling the learner, trying to model the behavior, we're trying to develop a user profile. Another is we're trying to mine some kind or understand some type of relationship. That relationship may be discourse-oriented. It may also be, it could be social networks, even though that's something I'll talk about a little bit. But we're trying to understand some nature of the relationship that the learner has either with the content or with other learners. Another aspect, and this will come out in a bit when I talk about personalization, is this knowledge domain modeling. And that's where we're trying to understand the space of content and the way in which knowledge entities are related. Fourth point relates to trend prediction, or trend analysis and prediction. This is what it gets a lot of attention because it's sexier, if you will, and it relates to the need to identify at-risk students and so on. But it's really about being able to identify which students are at risk and which students do need what types of support. The holy grail, though, is something around the area of personalization and adaptive learning. This is where we start looking at recommender systems, or where we start to do a better job of adapting the content that we have to individual learners. Again, that's a topic I'll pick up in a little bit. And then the 6th point is around structural analysis. And that's where either looking at network analysis, information flow, why do ideas go viral on Reddit, for example. So my argument is within the domain of these 6 key areas, everything that we do within the learning analytics space fits into one of those categories. And one of the opportunities that we have within this space is this idea of a learning analytics maturity model. And apparently I'm in possession of small fonts and not afraid to use them. And so for those of you that can't see this, basically this is a stage level of sophistication around learning analytics. So at the bottom corner, it's just, and this is from an organizational lens. So the first part I just covered off is what are analytics approaches and techniques that are prominent. This is the organizational impact. And this is based on a report I did last year with a couple of colleagues from the Australian government on using learning analytics to improve the competitiveness of the Australian higher education sector. So in the bottom corner, you just see this is an organization that's aware of learning analytics. They're not necessarily doing much with it. They might have basic reports. They might be working with log data. Moving up, they might be starting to do some experimentation. They might be thinking of basic dashboards to provide either designers or teachers. Eventually, you look at where you've got systemic activity happening, where your students, your faculty, and the organization as a whole has access to analytics. And then we see the red arrow pointing to that's structural or that's organizational transformation. And this is where you begin to rethink your teaching and learning practices specifically through the use of analytics and the way in which you can use predictive models to identify at-risk students, ways in which you can personalize the learning process. So for most organizations, it's this point where you begin to use, for all the talk, let me try a different angle, for all the talk that we have around change in universities and the scope of which that change is going to unfold, we don't really, or we to date haven't spent enough time thinking about how are we going to track and manage whether some of those changes are useful, practical, or even helpful? And so at this point, it's where all the changes that are happening are moving to competency-based learning, or moving to whatever new software we want to do, or developing learning profile. The intent of using learning analytics at a reasonably sophisticated level is that we use the inputs or the outputs that we're seeing as a way of guiding our organizational transformation, so that we change pedagogical practice through analytics. Then the final point, which was again from an Australian report, but it's around sector transformation, where regions that are heavily embedded in analytics will have a competitive advantage over regions that aren't using analytics to support their students. So from a variety of reasons, variety of approaches, what are learning analytics going to do for education? There's a few up on the screen here. I won't go through those in detail, but there's a range of opportunities that the use of data will provide for learners and for educators. And I think it's very important that learners see what the university sees in their own data. The data should be as student-facing as it is teacher-facing. Now, one of the points I mentioned was the proliferation, or the holy grail, which is personalization. And it's worth noting that if you have a one-to-one teacher-to-student ratio, you don't need analytics, because essentially what the educator is doing is analytics-based. They're engaging with students, they're listening to the students, they're asking questions, the range goes on. So they're actively involved in dialoguing with the student. And so you don't need personalized learning because the teacher is doing it. But once you ramp up to hundreds of students, or now with open online courses where you may have thousands or even tens of thousands of students, that conversation changes completely. And so then you start to turn to personalized learning models. And much like many of the examples I gave on what we do with learning analytics pulls from research that's 20, 30, 40 years old, the same holds true with the idea of personalization and attempts for personalized instruction or mastery level instruction. And the work that's been done with systems like CMU around tutors, or University of Memphis, the work that Art Gracer and others have done. So there's intelligent agents. There's a lot of work that's already been done. One of the more interesting organizations that I've engaged with, and I suppose many of you are probably familiar already, is Newton. And they're essentially creating a personalization platform. So partnering heavily with publishers, meaning that if you have a textbook, you engage with Newton, it chunks it up into personalizable blocks, and it's the new publishing platform. So you have, within the space of personalization, two primary players. One, the platform players that want you to use their system, and two, the publishers that sometimes partner with platform players, but in other instances are creating some of their own software as well. So from a personalization end, it's essentially the process is we identify the content, we map it structurally, the key elements, we create a personalized learner knowledge graph, and namely, what does this student know, and then we provide that student with personalized content or interactions based on the data that we have. This is relevant because almost all of the education system that we engage with on a daily basis has been content-oriented. When you start a new program, the topic often is, well, what's the content that we know? So the university system, the higher education system, has been very content-centric. But going forward, there has to be a shift from this content-centric view where we know our content to a view where we instead know the learner. And so going forward, understanding the learner, what the learner knows, her experiences, her profile of knowledge, those are things that start to become more and more important. And I'll put this under this broad idea of a personal knowledge graph, namely that all of us should have, and much like you can, if you use LinkedIn, and I use LinkedIn primarily just to accept invites. I don't know if I've ever done anything practical on LinkedIn, but if you use LinkedIn and other systems where you get a nice social network of people that you're connected with, basically it's the same idea around a personal knowledge graph. It's that you know what you know, and I'll flesh this out in just a bit. And it needs to be learner open. It needs to be open for a variety of reasons. Now, so some of the work, and Newton does this, a range of other organizations you're familiar with linked data and semantic web. I mean, these are just semantic technologies in general. The primary intent is to make content understandable by technology. So Google's knowledge graph, for example, which is their search iteration to move away from PageRank, is essentially about concept relatedness or entity relatedness. So if you go to a site called metaacademy.org, this is, you see what I'm referring to, which is the networked and in some cases hierarchical attributes of knowledge within a series of particular disciplines. It's just how is the information related. From there, we then end up with a simple compare and contrast. So the learner knowledge, which is the personal learner knowledge graph that I mentioned, we know what the learner knows. We compare it to what is needed to be known within a discipline, something the universities have done well. And that ultimately ends up with some degree or some kind of identification of competence. Put another way, you could go into a university with your knowledge graph and you could say, this is what I know. And the university could look at their curriculum and compare it with what you've exposed about what you know, and they can say, oh, okay, you're 82% of your way to being a nurse. If you want to get into computer science, you're 65% of your way up to a bachelor's degree, and if you want to get into landscaping, you're 38% there. So the intent here is to say we already know content well, and we know content relatedness well. We're doing a better job of that through, as I mentioned, linked data and semantic technologies and knowledge graphs, but the area that we haven't developed well is around what do students know, personal knowledge graph, and that's the core of the personalization process. So, creativity. Well, this gets back to a point that I just mentioned, which is that knowledge is really a pattern of connection. So what we know is a function of how we've connected things. And new knowledge builds on what's already known, and innovation then needs a space of openness where we can form these connections. So here's just an example. This is good old rocket. So it's a great example of the way in which creativity spans centuries, or in some cases goes back thousands and thousands of years. So rocket is typically known as this is the first locomotive, but a brilliant invention of humanity. And yet when you look back at it, you'll see that it's not a thing in itself. Instead, it's thousands of threads that lead back to the very beginning of the modern world that eventually produced rocket. And it's things such as wheels, and it's steam, and it's motion, it's scientific progress, it's entrepreneurship, and a range of factors at play. So much of what we define as being innovation is actually just novel recombinations of what already exists. And so if you begin to close down access to those novel recombinations, and Lessig makes a similar argument, you eventually stun the ability of an era or a generation to be creative and innovative. So this process then is much more like stitching things together than pioneering something completely from scratch. And even the iPhone, which is probably one of the more interesting innovations that has come across me in a matter of 5 years, has become such a part of their daily lives. I read yesterday that for 79% of the population, we spent less than 2 hours away from our smartphone during the day. But I was thinking, 2 hours? I mean, try it 30 seconds, right? But it's this sense in which a tool or a technology that we think is revolutionary actually relies on a huge legacy body of scientific research. The iPhone is essentially a novel recombination of a group of research projects and activities that go back about a century. So that's a general idea. In our society today, the kinds of learners that we need in order to be knowledge-oriented workers are not routine laborers, but individuals who are capable of cross-pollinating ideas, connecting dots, and to combine and recombine these pieces so that we're building completely new things. So this general idea of combinatorial creativity is central. So that's the idea of creativity. From there, I want to transition to sense-making and what sense-making is. So sense-making comes from, there's a huge body of literature in this area. It's a term that we use on a daily basis almost. You'll say, well, that doesn't make sense. Well, yeah, okay, I understand. I think that makes sense. So we use this term without really often thinking about what's the underpinning aspect of it. And the research that goes back to what Brenda Durbin has done, or what's been done by Carl White, or Gary Klein, or Dave Snow, or a range of other researchers, is actually quite substantive in identifying how is it that human beings make sense of the world. How do they embrace complexity, which is more the norm today than it's ever been? But how do they embrace and interact with complexity in a way that they can act meaningfully? So sense-making is basically this attempt to understand connections and then to get a sense of their trajectory so that we can act appropriately. Or it could be looked at as a way of labeling and categorizing the experiences that we encounter every day so that we can stabilize that experience and make sense of it. Now, traditionally, we've made sense through stories and narratives and knowledge exchanges and discourse. This has worked very well. As I mentioned earlier, if you have a one-to-one relationship with a student and a teacher, you really don't need learning analytics because the observations of the educator are sufficient to provide that guidance. But what happens when you have the explosion of information that we have today, and when the data that we have in our society exceeds the cognitive capacity of human beings to make sense of it, then we need to start turning to alternative approaches and alternative tools. And so the technical approaches of learning analytics are needed because we can't go through the logs in even a 30-person course. The tens of thousands of data points collected in a weekly point of interactions, we can't go through those logs manually and make sense of what happens. So in order to do that, we begin to rely on analytics techniques and processes that will basically abstract up that knowledge work to a higher level where we can use methods and techniques to unearth or identify connections that exist. At a more sophisticated level, we begin to visualize and present those patterns and connections in a way that anyone can interact with meaningfully without necessarily having deep awareness of the techniques that exist in underneath. So just to sort of wrap that sort of part up a little bit, sense-making is one of these driving activities that we do on a daily basis. Sometimes it's structured, sometimes we do it in a collective way. A lot of daily sense-making could be as simple as where's the room that this conference is being held in today? What do I need to do to answer this email? It could be a large part of mapping to existing knowledge, which I've already talked about, where we identify what's known and then we map that to a student's knowledge profile. But more and more, the work of, those are the quadrants on the left, the crisis and new knowledge quadrants, which are grappling with phenomena that can't yet be mapped, but that requires creativity and innovation in order to address. So adaptivity and personalization addresses the quadrants on the left. It can help us make sense of what we already know and provide us with content structured pathways through it. The quadrants on the right, though, are quite different in that these are areas where we don't have the answers yet because they're emerging. And as a result of the emergence of those answers, we can't rely on learning analytics to give us that structured way of mapping what I know, what the domain is all about, and then providing commendation on whether I understand it or not. So these are the future quadrants of work, which means that when we start talking analytics, understanding the formation of new knowledge and responding in complex information abundant settings starts to become more central. Now, the main point of the talk, which is open learning analytics. I would argue that traditionally the education system has looked a bit like this. So we have content, curriculum, and teaching practices on your left. We have the assessment process on the bottom, and then we have the learner. In the education system, future value and sustainability of universities and colleges is going to be prefaced on one key condition. And that is, if it can be duplicated with little additional economic input, it cannot serve as a value point for identifying the future of the university. Meaning, if I can take a lecture and record it and broadcast it hundreds of times, and it only costs me pennies or less for each of the times it's done, then that approach can't be a key part of the future of education. If you teach a course and do it in a MOOC format, for example, where most of what you're doing is video head recordings, then that's a model that can quite easily be adopted and duplicated by someone else at a related university that's doing something similar. On the other hand, if each pedagogical practice that you engage in requires a new economic input, then you have a sustainable model for the future of education. Meaning that if I can lecture at you and you listen, you could have recorded this, and I wouldn't have had to be here, other than maybe a few handshakes and a nice to see you again conversations. But if you can record that and make that available for individuals, what becomes valuable then is the pedagogical experience that you create around that. Meaning that experiential learning, pedagogy that emphasizes social interaction, that emphasizes sense-making practices around complex and emerging phenomena, those are things that can serve as an economic value point. So again, the key point from my lens, at least in the future university, is if it can be duplicated without cost, it can't serve as a key strategy point for universities going forward. Meaning that we need to begin thinking of pedagogy and teaching and learning practices as a central aspect. So traditionally, we had this approach where you have the content, the teaching, we teach our students, we assess our students, and there we go, we give you a degree, and we monetize, we think, all aspects of that process. So for example, we would have looked at and said, well, we monetize teaching. We charge you by course credit hour, we charge you by courses that you take. We also monetize assessment. If you, let's say, have a forward-thinking system that's already engaging with prior learning assessment and recognition. So we start to monetize the assessment practices, and Microsoft has done this with their certification, and so have other software organizations. Going forward, though, in an age where you have a range of learning opportunities that aren't controlled and defined by the instructor, open online courses, you have informal learning, workplace learning, competency-based learning, you have individuals who are not committed to necessarily one institution. And again, this all ties back to the diversifying profile of our students. Students we have in higher education today aren't the 17 to 23, 22-year-old students that we've had in the past. As a result, they come with different needs, different knowledge practices, and we can't assume the same base level understanding. So in the future, for university systems, we can't monetize teaching practices we've done in the past, plain lecture formats. Assessment to a greater degree can be monetized, especially low-level activity through automatic grading in a lot of cases. Ideally, though, what we will monetize in the future as a college or university system is this process of creating the personalized learner knowledge graph and then taking what the learner knows with the needed content in a discipline, and we'll monetize gap-filling learner proficiencies because they'll have learned across multiple spaces. So why are some of these things important, and why is open learning analytics important in this conversation? I think a primary area is that an economy that's based on knowledge work is a revolving economy. It doesn't have the stability of a routine labor work where you go to work and do the same thing until you retire. You probably heard the statistics of people will, in the future, even today, change careers, fundamentally change careers 5 to 7 times over the duration of their working life. So we need a higher degree of mobility, and a higher degree of mobility in a knowledge economy needs to be supported by a greater fluidity and access to advanced learning opportunities as well. So we need to create an efficient learning opportunity, and analytics play a key role in this process. So one of the things that we've started looking at, and an argument that I've made in the past, I think Chuck's probably heard me say it 3 or 4 times now, is that we're sort of at the last cycle of dramatic changes in LMSs. Meaning that universities going forward aren't going to be doing this every 5 years and we revisit our LMS. Universities now, as an LMS starts to deploy learning analytics functionality, becomes central to the university operation because it's tied to the student information system. The analytics models are built on top of that data, which means that we're going to have relationships with our LMSs going forward the same way that we have relationships with our enterprise systems today. Which means you change them once, it's a hellish experience, and you vow never to do that again. And so analytics, though, as analytics becomes more prominent in these systems, and as the LMS starts to become multifunctionality in terms of competency-based learning and alternative pedagogies, the importance of analytics being open is vital for these kinds of platforms. We need to be able to see what are the decisions being made algorithmically about our students. What determines whether a student gets a certain recommendation over another? What determines whether we identify a student as being at risk versus a student that we identify as being progressing well in their learning activity? There's a report that was published in New York Times about a week ago called Who Gets to Graduate, basically was the theme of it. And the big outcome they emphasized was looking at University of Texas at Austin. They found that your SAT scores were not the big predictor of academic success that we sometimes would like to think they are. The #1 determinant on whether a student graduated was income, the income of their parents. So you had a student who was from the top quartile income-wise in society, they had about a 90% chance of getting their degree. If you were in the bottom 50%, you were down to about 25% chance of getting a degree. You could score with your SATs at the same level as someone else with a higher economic status, and they would do better in university than you would. Now, there's a range of factors that need to be explored on why is that. Is it all about the support systems that are in place? Is it about the stress or a variety of other factors? But the big issue is our analytic systems that our LMS providers and other organizations make available to us need to account for these different profiles of different students in different contexts. So one of the things that we've been in, recently had a summit on this topic following our Learning Analytics conference with Apereo was to look at what does an open learning analytics platform look like, and how can we start to create a system that makes analytics and the practice of analytics an operational practice the same way that providing content to our students in the form of a learning management system or similar platform is a key organizational software system. So our interest then is under the banner of Open Learning Analytics. It's a project that is still in the early stages, but I think we're all reasonably excited about the prospect of what this might be able to do in making the education system a little bit more practical, a little bit more focused. So things that we would expect to come out of the learning analytics or the Open Learning Analytics system is a variety of functionality that pulls data from different spaces. The data store questions haven't been addressed fully or even at all, I guess, in some cases. But we've looked at a variety of different models on what might it look like if you're pulling data from a range of different institutional systems. Would you treat this as a plug-in to an existing LMS, or would you treat this as a completely standalone system that then draws from it an integrated database that allows us then to make decisions organizationally around learning practices? And these decisions might be things such as, how is a learner developing cognitively? Is the learner socially well connected to other learners in the class, and how does that influence their ability to continue learning, especially if they come from a certain socioeconomic profile? We could look at things such as automatically operationalizing models or frameworks of pedagogy, such as the community inquiry model. Could you, and we've been reasonably successful with this, but could you determine the level at which social and cognitive presence exists in a course? And are there interventions that you can activate early on to ensure that the cognitive presence aspect is fully addressed or attended to? And a range of other factors that could be looked at from core analytics functionality. From there, there's other practices such as creating personalized adaptive learning and the content infrastructure, as well as interventions. How do you connect with your learners either through recommender systems or through automated interventions or interventions? So that's the basic overview of the project. It's, for lack of a better word, the term we've used, it's sort of an Apache project for analytics, where researchers, faculty, universities, and the learners themselves are aware of the ways in which algorithms and analytics approaches are making decisions about the content that they'll see, and are making decisions about how they're going to be taught and the kinds of interventions that will be used to address their particular circumstance. So all of those things, in light of the discussion I presented earlier, the topics I presented earlier about creativity as a combinatorial task, in the same sense, making the analytics layer transparent to the learner and to the institution and to the faculty member starts to become a key activity in what it is with the practice that we engage in the university setting. Final point on a wrap up, be aware we've got our next Learning Analytics Conference happening at Marist in next year, March 16th to 20th, so just put that on your radar. I think I've now got about 11 minutes for questions, so there's a mic set up here if you want to ask any questions. If not, we will briefly look at each other awkwardly, and I'll wrap up.
What, Bob?
Okay. It's like you're walking the runway. We want a little more stuff.
So, I wanted to ask, in opening up the analytics, is there potential to open it up to instructors and students in such a way that they can use this information to determine their own learning path without it being guided adaptively by the system itself? So there are values in many circumstances for learning to learn in a new way, but that's a form of learning as well. I think the thing that can make instructors nervous is the idea that an analytic system will be making the decision about the way a student will learn, the way search engines start to return certain results to you because they've gathered information about you in the past and what you're interested in. And that would make a lot of people, including me, very nervous that I'd like to have that information, but for the instructor and the student to be in a position of determining, do I continue learning in the way that I'm comfortable with, or is there greater value
in my attempting to learn in a way that I'm not comfortable with and not currently.
Yeah, there's a couple of really important questions in there. I think on the one hand, the information that we see on Facebook or to a lesser degree on Twitter, but it's algorithmically driven basically. And so I guess I would argue that one way or another, that's going to happen. So one way or another, whether we're dealing with a proprietary LMS, with a proprietary learning analytics system, decisions will be made for us. And my point is that the best way to have control over that is for it to be open. The best way for us to have influence in that is to be open, so we understand what our algorithm's doing on our behalf. So just as a quick perspective, I would say, it'd be difficult perhaps to move it 100% out of the system because it's out of a central system that's tied to the institution. I certainly think that there's a question of data ownership that could be addressed in that regard. But by and large, all of the questions that need to be had around privacy and ethics and so on need to be prefaced on openness and on an open platform. So if you are already using yes, most people in this room aren't using Blackboard Analytics. But let's just say hypothetically you are a dual LMS shop. You don't always know what's being done on your behalf. Or if you're using D2L, or if you're starting to use, let's say, Canvas or other systems that are making some decisions and visualizations on your behalf. What if you wanted to, I think every visualization should have much like legal documents need to have plain word provisions, it needs to clearly say we did this and this with these data sources and this is how we did it. So that an average person, because it's an algorithmic world, and we need to begin thinking algorithmically in order for us to engage, in order for us really to be literate. Thank you.
So there have been billions of dollars invested in the world's most advanced analytics platform, and that is the platform that decides what ad to show me when I visit a website. And that analytics is insanely stupid, right? And all I have to do is say the word hot tub in the search box, and for a month and a half I'm shown hot tub ads, even though it just seems like if they could sort of impute a little more information about me for billions of dollars and the greatest and brightest and most expensive minds on the planet, it seems to me like the first thing that analytics is going to do in terms of conclusions that it reaches is going to be pretty lousy, actually. I'm curious if you think about the lousiness and how we get past the lousiness and sort of where we get through all that.
It's a really important question. It's slightly off topic, but just because you mentioned cocktails. I started off years ago in the hospitality field, and I had a colleague, so I was at Red River College, which was a culinary institute, and we had a faculty member, this is in the late 90s, mid-90s, I guess. He was new to the web, and so he wanted to have, for cocktails, he wanted to, one of these beverages you light on fire and impress the students, whatever else. So I said, well, just go search for it. So then he came back out, he's all flushed. I said, what's wrong? And he says, I searched flaming cocktails. And I said, anyway, he was traumatized. That's a good example.
Just even a secret next Sunday.
Yeah, that's right. I think you're raising a valid question around will the product be lousy? And probably the short answer is it absolutely will. And some parts will be better. Even now, simple discussion forum or threaded discussion interactions can provide you a social network that you can then make decisions on how well connected different students are. And generally, we would say if you're well connected, that suggests you're going to do better in the course and a range of other aspects that come out of it. But short term, anything advanced where you're trying to do language matching, because it's such a dumb way, literally, of trying to provide content, because until you really get the knowledge graph fully defined, or where we're going to have those mismatches where it doesn't understand what I'm looking for. My favorite example is that I did a machine learning analytics workshop for the Learning Analytics Conference about a month and a half ago. And so I searched for machine learning websites. And instead what I got as, this is a bad example of machine learning failure, but what I got as suggested URLs were motor education. And so it was just this odd contrast where the system isn't intelligent enough yet. I don't know how to do that otherwise than through openness. I know you mentioned there's billions of dollars that have gone into systems that don't get your search results right. By the same account, there's probably been tens of billions of dollars in research going on in universities around the world where academics are doing analytics-related work, where that could have influence analytics, but they're not connected. They're not engaged with one another. So what we're trying to do with this Open Learning Analytics project is to leverage existing activity rather than to create something from ground zero. It's about stitching together what's already there and putting leverage in areas that are promising. And to move through the first few crack versions as quickly as we can to the point where we get something a little more sophisticated.
So I'll ask another question. How do you see the sort of legal and policy from the government kind of issues going forward, as it's almost like if this becomes too successful, it's going to lead to its own failure because it's going to feel like Big Brother, and then we're going to have a FERPA-like thing that's like a FANPA, which is a Federal Analytics Something Act, that says that you can't do it, what the rules are all of a sudden, if it feels like there's too much Big Brother going on. Do you see that as a trend that people go like, sure, I don't care, like they do in Facebook, but I don't care? Or do you think we're going to like get all excited like FERPA and create these really strict rules about this knowledge and information?
It's a great question again. I don't know how that will trend. I suspect, because we have a fair degree of paranoia around data and privacy, that most likely it will veer toward the over compensation or policy end. And right now what we're doing with analytics is well ahead of the legal policy and framework that guides our practice in that area. Not just analytics generally, not even learning analytics, which gets a little bit more complex as well. By the same account, there's a bit of an imperative on the people who engage in learning analytics to make the value case for it. And so I treat data and analytics as essentially being a transactional entity, the same way that money is a transactional entity. So if I go into a store and I say I like that, then I give them money and I have a sense of value. Was that a good deal for me or not? And I think when we get to the university sector, when students own their own knowledge profiles, they can walk in and they can go to the university and say, the university can say, you know, expose your whatever, these parts of your profile to us. And then we can target and personalize learning for you. A learner can say, I don't want that. But ultimately, I think it's this sense where once learners become educated in what will analytics do for you, not what's it doing for the system, they can see what you're doing. We have to get past that creepiness factor, but that's one possible way around it, but that's a long-term conversation to get people to think of data analytics as a transactional problem.
So, as you know, George, we've been talking a lot, working in the community here in Apereo on analytics. So I'm curious, what would kind of excite you from your perspective in general in solar and specifically open learning analytics that might come out of this community that would help accelerate some of the things you've done?
Well, I think one thing is momentum. So I think it's having folks that are willing to become involved in the discussion, either to become involved in framing the scope of what learning analytics could be from an open platform, or secondly, from a technical platform, becoming involved in what does that system look like. One of the things that this community has extensive experience with that we don't have in Solar is with big scale development and deployment of software. For our case, it's researchers who have familiarity with data, the analysis process. So when this conversation was first started, I thought it's a great mix for that, to have an established community who knows how to deploy large-scale software with a group of researchers who feel they know a few things about learning. So I think that's what I see as being the greatest outcome, is momentum in people that say, I'd like to become involved, join mailing lists, partake in the discussion, and so on. We've got 2 questions here, and then I think we'll wrap up, because I think I'm supposed to be done at 8:30. So.
It seems like there's a public education problem around algorithmic complexity. The sort of technology forces are training consumers into thinking things should just work. Right? Don't worry about what's under the hood. And then the people who are deploying the most sophisticated, complex algorithms, whether it's Google or the NSA, are strongly disinvested in telling us about that algorithm. And then some of these algorithms are deeply counterintuitive. So I'm wondering how you think algorithmic complexity can be surfaced in an open way, in a manner that is clearly understandable and comprehensible. You look at the result and you can understand the algorithm.
Yeah, ideally, I would like to see that in addition to the way that we now share data sets in some cases, let's say with LMS data or MOOC data, a variety of other systems that make these tools available, or the resources available, we should certainly have a space where we can share algorithms the way that, let's say, you share code on Git or other systems. So I think for a university or for a group of researchers to have a repository of algorithms that do certain things. And I really think that in the world that is trending in such a direction that you can't be the one person that knows all this stuff. Meaning that you might be great with architecting an algorithm, but you might not understand the criteria that are critical. But a learning scientist might know what are the critical criteria, and then together, combined, you're able to solve a very difficult challenge because you've got the right people doing their own, it's connected specialization. But so the algorithms need to be clearly presented in a way that people can understand. Like we understand, I think, what Google initially tried to do, like backrub, which became PageRank, was a simple idea that was based on Garfield's journal impact factor, right? Which links point to things and what they mean. Now, it was instantiated, mathematically and technologically, that algorithm, but we can understand what it does. The same thing with NSA. If they say, here's what we look for, they're not going to tell us, but the point is, what an algorithm does can typically be easily explained in an English language or whatever language you want to use. So I would expect to see a repository of algorithms that are open. People can view them and look at how they're structured, how they've been coded, and then be able to understand, even for layman's terms, a simple, what is this and this all about, if that makes sense.
You mentioned three sort of major engines, the adaptive learning, intervention, and analytics engine. If you had to sort of put those in order, say, for a community could focus on trying to build open source alternatives, or what order would you put them in, maybe why?
I would probably put, they're obviously all related and they depend on one another, but I would say the core analytics engine and something that's almost WordPress-like in terms of plugins, where you've got the core engine which defines how new plugins can be loaded, and by plugins I'm really meaning algorithms, can be activated and used on a data set. Now we've been working with the folks from I'm involved with the Pittsburgh Learning Science, the data shop, which is probably the largest, most used open data set in the world in terms of the data warehouse or the infrastructure that you would need in order to make that happen. So these are all interconnected, but really the first thing you need to do is you need to design and architect the core system for analytics that determines how our plugins going to be, or how our new algorithms going to be brought in if you're doing text analysis or if you're doing network analysis. And all of these are going to be different. Right now, if you do it, and this is the issue, we're pre-Microsoft Office, right? Where I've got if I'm in Lotus 123, I don't have the opportunity to cut and paste and import into WordPerfect. So when we're doing social network analysis, we're using Snap, for example, or we might be using Cometrix for some level of discourse or text analysis or Lightside or whatever we're using, but we're always shifting different tools. If you had one set interface that determined how different, if they were clearly architected, so if a person gets a new grant to start work on a certain subject area, they could structure their system to play well with this core analytics engine. I think that would be the main starting point. And then from there, personalization, intervention strategies. I think we're out of time. Thanks very much.